Alright, it's time for a follow-up. I bought these YuanPads about a year ago, and while I haven't made it my sole duty to grind DDR or ITG at home, I've definitely spent some hours on them. Enough to know that things had to change a bit on the modding side, since I made a lot of mistakes and I had a lot of failed attempts trying to get it to work when I was originally working on it. Plus, a bunch of other people in the community had some great ideas on how to improve the setup, as well as some updates for the pads themselves, like some new firmware and all of that. So, it's about time we revisited these things. I originally made the other YuanPad video because there wasn't a lot of documentation about this pad in particular, and it looks like that hasn't really changed apart from some discussions in some various discords, so I'll try and do a little bit more documentation. If you want to know how these things came ship and the buying process, you can check out my other video that I made previous to this one. This thing has been performing great with my original amateur modding, which I think speaks volumes to the quality of this thing, but the cracks were beginning to show when I was starting to get more into the faster foot switches and bracket patterns, where it kind of felt like the pad and the modding was holding me back no matter how much I practiced. Nothing really felt consistent, and it felt like I was working a lot harder than I needed to for certain tech. So this video is going to be about the more in-depth modding process and what others in the community have tried. So since that original video was made like right after I got these things, there's a lot of talk about not wanting to remove anything because I was afraid of accidentally ruining the pad. That time has absolutely passed. I've had these things for over a year now, and it turns out that I was incredibly scared for absolutely nothing. Alright, so this is one of the panels that I haven't modded yet to remove the risers. So all you do is you unscrew these screws that are within the yellow corner ones. So those should pop out. Then you can take these guys out. Like so, like that, and like that. Now, this orange riser was actually connected with the same screws, so it kind of just lifts out, and this sensor channel is just glued onto here. So you kind of just peel this guy off, and the infamous orange riser is no more. Boom, it's out. Now, when you put these guys back in, like so, and you eventually screw those down, you'll now have the same as a normal unmodded, un-YuanCon DDR thing where you can put stuff under the sensor channel.
From there, since I always wanted my pads to be a bit bouncier, I decided to take inspiration from the silicone maxing document for Pump It Up pads that swears by using silicone strips or just rubber under the sensor channels to lift them back up with a more compressible material while still getting the panel to be flush. You're basically replacing the old orange riser with a better material so it doesn't feel like concrete. I was initially concerned with the sensor channel moving around on top of the silicone strips since it's no longer glued to anything, but once additional modding is added and the panel sits snug beneath the brackets, it doesn't seem like much of an issue, but I might figure out an easy but still removable way to keep the sensor in place down the line if I run into any consistency issues. I found that 4mm of silicone under the sensor channels is about right, which would be 2 strips of 2mm silicone stacked on top of each other, since adding one more layer to 6mm caused some sensors to be too sensitive and started triggering on their own when screwing down the corner brackets. This is generally why it's a good idea to buy a sheet of 2mm and a sheet of 1mm silicone so you can fine-tune the height where you need to. By just doing this step without any additional modding, even if your panels still slide around a little bit or the L brackets rattle, it's a huge upgrade to the feel of the pad if you want your steps to have a little bit of give to them. It might not seem like much, especially if you've just started playing dance games, but trust me, it's huge. Once you have the amount of silicone you want under the sensor channels, you can use tape or whatever material you want on the L brackets in order to dial in the sensitivity. A lot of people, including myself, really like Gorilla Tape, but you can also use painter's tape in conjunction for really small adjustments. You can do your own research on putting tape on the underside or on the top of the L brackets since it does matter, but for mine, I started with one large strip on the bottom, one large strip on the top, and then started putting smaller squares of tape on either sides on the top of the L bracket to finish making it more sensitive. The smaller squares help with reducing the area that the force on top of the panel will be applied to, resulting in less overall pressure needed to activate the sensor because physics. When talking about force over an area, that's pressure. And if the same amount of force from a larger area is transferred to a smaller area, it will increase the pressure on the smaller area, meaning the sensor should activate with less pressure on the overall panel area. Physics.
All right, so let's take a look at what some of this modding actually looks like. So as you can see here, under the sensor channel, there's going to be your 4 millimeters of silicone. I got two 2 millimeter silicone strips that basically they're meant to replace the orange riser. So this is where the orange riser was before. We're basically just adding that height back in with silicone instead of hard plastic. So that is the point of that. The rest of the modding right now is on this L bracket. So for consistency's sake, I'm using only Gorilla Tape right now. There's that layer of Gorilla Tape under the L bracket, the layer of Gorilla Tape over the L bracket, and then these two smaller squares to add the amount of sensitivity needed on the outsides. The rest of this Gorilla Tape on the inside is meant to dampen the L bracket hitting the sides. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but this is the method that I chose to go for right now. It was pretty simple. You can do a 3D printed housing here for the screws, and that will keep the L bracket from rattling, but I found that this works pretty well. So once I have this guy screwed in, that is pretty much all of the modding completed. And then your panel can go on top. One thing that I realized when working with this was that now that these corners are down farther, all of the panel now rests on top of the L bracket. So now you can check it before you screw it back down to see how high your modding actually goes. So whenever these guys get screwed down in, this panel has to be high enough in order for it to be sucked down to have more resting pressure. If this is lower than this corner metal thing here, this bracket actually won't push down on this panel at all, and it'll be free to move around. So you can actually check yourself before having to put in all the screws and do all that. It saves you a ton of time. So from there, once you put all these in, some tips and tricks that I've learned is that you want to make sure that you pull your corner bracket into the panel when you screw it down. You can see there's a little bit of play in this thing. And this panel actually doesn't go all the way to the corner here. So you want to make sure that this corner is over this panel as much as possible so it doesn't move or get pulled out. When I was trying some tension modding on the outside, this panel actually was able to move and it was able to pop out of these corner brackets. So just make sure that you pull this in so that you have the most amount of area of that corner bracket over the panel. So another thing is reducing that panel movement like this. In order to simplify things, I decided to just use a strip of silicone. So you can actually take one of those strips of silicone that you used for under the sensor channel and you can place it in here. I'll probably have to cut this guy down, but you can place it on the side once you get everything done, and now this will sit in here, and now this won't be able to move to the side anymore because it's built up on this side. I found that to be
pretty simple. So that's the basic modding. Again, I will reiterate, people have been doing this for 20 plus years now. You should definitely do your own research and figure out the kind of modding and the kind of feel that you want your pad to have, because I am still very much a novice, but this is what I'm doing for mine.
Since this was a complete rehaul of all of the modding I had attempted up to this point, I was way more concerned with consistency rather than perfection, since a lot of the variables about the pad were going to change by removing these risers. I think it's important for people getting into the hobby or buying one of these things to get some transparent and realistic expectations on what this process actually looks like. Getting both pads redone for this setup took easily over 20 hours, even without the time spent making this video. All of the modding that I had previously did probably took double or even triple that in work time. So I'm probably getting close to about 100 hours of tape cutting and panel unscrewing, which isn't uncommon for an at-home DDR player nowadays. There's a reason why there's a ton of these images floating around the community, because it's 100% true. That being said, I think that unless you've been entrenched in this for a long time, consistency over perfection is key. I can't stress that enough. The rush that you get when first modding because you think that you can create the perfect setup after playing on terrible arcade pads for years is absolutely real, but the time sink is also very real. My goal with this round of modding was to establish a firm and consistent baseline using as few materials as possible, and do slight tweaks in the future if necessary, rather than trying to remod if even one little thing felt a little bit off. Every panel on every pad will be slightly different, so it's important to have a consistent plan going in when starting to mod, to try and save yourself some time and headache, since 90% of pad modding is unscrewing and rescrewing the same panel over and over again. There are tons of different modding strategies, and I even tried some of them before settling on the simpler system I'm showing now. I heard from other YuanPad owners that the tension mod works very well, which is where you disconnect all but the inside sensor and really build up the outside edge and the sides so that the corner brackets will really push down on the panel, causing it to be stuck in place. You can then add modding on the inside sensor so it's incredibly sensitive, but when I tried this, the panel kept slipping out of the back corner brackets, partially because the silicone under the sensor channels now allowed the panel to compress and shift a bit. I wasn't finding it consistent, so I gave up on the idea for now, but there's definitely a way to make it work if you do your own research and tinkering. The other big update to the YuanPad is the updated firmware that allows for a 1000 Hz polling rate, which is a huge deal. The firmware itself is still useful, but I think everybody has agreed at this point that the pressure threshold sensors are generally useless, except for really specific circumstances. It could be useful if your modding strategy just has a bit too much resting pressure on one of the sensors and upping the threshold fix it, but I wouldn't use it as a way to consistently mod your pad. There hasn't really been any other issues with the pad on the whole, other than the steel creaking a little bit nowadays. There's no structural issues, there's no issues with the pad suddenly not working, and once it's modded, it feels extremely consistent. I'm overall still really happy with the purchase, and I hope that I can continue to dial these things in over the years. I would still want a better way to dampen the sound of the pad, maybe find a better bar wrap to give it a little bit more cushion and a little bit more diameter, and maybe fix some issues I had with certain screws warping certain parts of the steel within the panels. But that can come later, since I'm very happy with how this round of modding turned out. Where I'll leave this is to kind of speak on the pad market as a whole right now, because sadly, in this environment, the innovation just isn't there yet to be trying new things that will kind of screw with the tried and tested methods. diehard fans have been working with this stuff for over 20 years to perfect methods using old equipment and have been able to accomplish some really incredible things in terms of what people are able to do and play nowadays. The market and interest in these things, though, just isn't high enough for somebody to take that risk yet for innovating one of these things, especially for the price point that they require. It's a weird conundrum where the community is still looking for pad manufacturers that can at least hit the arcade pad baseline before it seems like anybody really feels comfortable about making something newer and potentially better. The Orange Risers are a great example of a manufacturer trying to do their best to give the community what they have been clamoring about, which is flush and level panels. But it was done in a way that took some agency away from the player because there wasn't enough room to further improve the pad to their liking if the stock experience wasn't good enough. So everybody just goes back to the baseline, rips out the risers, which is the same one that DDR has been using since the 90s. True innovation will eventually be needed, like a mechanism or system to adjust sensitivity without having to remove the panel, or without having to stuff tape and silicone under parts. Maybe a pad that has been specifically tailored to have FSRs instead of always having them be some sort of retrofit. There's gotta be a better way to do a 4-panel stage that just detects when you step on it, right? But it's just too much of a risk, and the innovation has been through die-hard hobbyists looking to get the most out of these artifacts at this point, which is incredibly cool if you want to dive more into it. But overall, I'm just looking forward to enjoying these pads as much as I can, and they've been well worth the investment. Thanks for hearing me out, and hopefully this was helpful.